What was Rav Kook's attitude towards the Mizrahi?
First of all, we should define and be clear about that which we are about to discuss. We are speaking about Harav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Kook, the first Rav Kook, as opposed to his son, Harav Tzvi Yehuda Kook. And this point is relevant because, as we shall discuss, there is most definitely a difference between Rav Kook, the father, and his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, in this regard, as in many other regards. Secondly, we are discussing the Mizrahi movement, which was established in the year Tau Resh Samech Beth, 1902, according to the Gregorian calendar. It was established as a faction within the Zionist movement, and it was closely associated with Theodor Herzl, the founder of that movement. During Herzl's lifetime, the Mizrahi movement cooperated with him completely, to the extent that even the controversial suggestion of Herzl that the Zionist movement aim to establish a Jewish state in Uganda, an idea that had originally been floated by the British, was adopted by the Zionist Congress, and the Mizrahi movement also was part of that original consensus. When Theodor Herzl died in Tafresh Samech Daled, 1904, the Zionist Congress quickly raised the issue once again for discussion, because there had been much opposition to the Uganda suggestion, and many in the movement had been opposed, but had been essentially forced into agreeing by Herzl, and therefore when he died, the issue was re-examined and subsequently dropped. It was voted on once again, and that entire idea was rejected. The Mizrahi movement was a religious movement, on the one hand, that wished to find a way of existing within and being active within the Zionist movement, which was, by definition, an irreligious movement, in fact a secular movement, to the extent that at the very first Congress, the Zionist movement adopted the resolution that Zionism had nothing whatsoever to do with the Jewish religion. En latzianut davar im hadat. That was the language of the resolution in Hebrew. And it is therefore obvious that for the members of the Zionist religious faction, the Mizrahi, this statement, this resolution, was of course something that disturbed them very much. And as we see from several of the letters written by Rav Kook in the early years of the Zionist movement, it also bothered Rav Kook very, very much indeed. One such letter that we have from Rav Kook is from the year Tau Resh Ayin Gimel, 1913, which is sent to the leadership of the Mizrahi movement based in St. Louis in the United States. And he writes to them as follows. He says, whenever I find myself obligated to speak about the Mizrahi movement, I always make a point of emphasizing the following. And I'll read a few lines in Hebrew and translate. Sheyesh hok ehad shehu mehuyav leda'ati lahok al dirlo. There is one essential statement that the Mizrahi movement must state and emphasize and make absolutely clear, as it were, to raise this banner and constantly repeat this essential claim. And Rav Kook adds, it is only by making this position of the Mizrahi plain that this movement, the Mizrahi, can actually redeem itself, because Rav Kook felt that there was a very serious flaw from the inception of the Mizrahi. And he actually writes as follows: Sheyabi'a ha-Mizrahi begalui. The Mizrahi movement must make it plain, must state for all and sundry, Shelamroth ha'emun shehu mar'eh tamid lasinuth ha'klalith, despite its allegiance to the Zionist movement, in that the Mizrahi movement wishes to be part of this organization and wishes to participate in this great undertaking of returning the Jewish people to their homeland. Nevertheless, lohem hu im ze al haseif hayehidi hahakuk b'tzionuth od mitam haKongress harishon. Nevertheless, the Mizrahi movement opposes completely, without reserve, this statement, this resolution of the First Congress of the Zionist movement, namely that the Zionist movement has nothing to do with the Jewish religion. This resolution, this statement, which was adopted by the First Zionist Congress, says Rav Kook, essentially nullifies everything that the Mizrahi stands for. The Mizrahi was a movement that believed that the Jewish people must base their return and all their activities with regards to this great undertaking on the Torah, on Judaism, on continuing the great heritage of the Jewish people. And if the Mizrahi remains silent about this resolution, it essentially is living a lie. And Rav Kook continues, and therefore, how can the Mizrahi movement remain silent about this statement, this resolution, which is the diametric opposite of everything the Mizrahi believes in? And is therefore my view, my humble opinion, says Rav Kook, there is no alternative, there is no option for the Mizrahi movement, no way of succeeding and remaining true to its purpose, its stated aims, other than making these claims and presenting this position forcefully and without reservation, time and again, until it will be accepted by the Zionist movement, and that original resolution will be rescinded and a different resolution will take its place, namely that the Jewish people's claim to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, is based on their heritage, on the Torah, on Judaism, and that Judaism and the Torah form the basis of all of the Jewish people's activities in this regard. And it is interesting to note that Rav Kook, at the very beginning of this letter, before he even begins to express his criticism of the Mizrahi, he states plainly that in his view the Mizrahi movement is weighed down, in his words, by an inner contradiction. He says in Hebrew that the Mizrahi is tied down and needs to free itself from these ties, these cables which are holding it down and not allowing it to function as it must. This is a very telling statement. We see that Rav Kook felt that the Mizrahi movement was, from its inception, fatally flawed. And this is why Rav Kook never officially identified himself with the Mizrahi movement. It is true that he was on good terms with many of the leaders who held him in high regard, who turned to Rav Kook and asked for his advice on certain matters, and he respected them and their motivations. But he felt clearly that the way in which the Mizrahi movement was conducting its affairs and its reluctance, apparently its inability to state plainly what it believed to be true for reasons of expedience and pragmatism perhaps, he considered this to be unforgivable and something that could not last for very long. And here on page 164, Rav Kook writes that the Mizrahi movement must, for its own good, in order to fulfill its purpose, its destiny in the world, it must make plain that this statement, this resolution of the Zionist movement, that the Zionist movement has nothing to do with the Jewish religion or Jewish heritage, with the Torah, that this statement is unacceptable. Rav Kook refers to it as an imra mahpira, which means something which is embarrassing and unacceptable in the extreme. Rav Kook refers to this resolution as something toxic and poisonous, as if a snake bit itself and brought about its own demise. Rav Kook did not believe that the Zionist movement could succeed in bringing about for the Jewish people that which it intended to do without rescinding this statement, without accepting the fact that the Jewish people's return to their land is entirely bound up with Jewish heritage and with the Torah. And he goes on to say, as long as the Mizrahi does not speak plainly, Rav Kook refers to its statements and lack of clarity and lack of courage in expressing these positions. Rav Kook refers to this as de'oth musa'oth ufashranioth, average, mediocre, and ambiguous statements. שיש בהם מעין חולשה גופנית ורפיון נפשי אינן עלולות לנצח. The campaign to bring about the success of the Jewish people's return to their land will not be possible unless the Mizrahi makes these points plainly, openly, without fear and without reservation. And I will quote here from a third letter of Rav Kook from the same year, Tauresh Ein Gimel, 1913, to the Mizrahi movement at the Zionist Congress. This appears in the letter numbered Tau Chof Ein Aleph, 571, on page Resh Heth Resh Teth, 208, 209. And here Rav Kook writes as follows: HaMizrahi mukhrach liot b'tzionuth ma sheYisrael ba'amim. The Zionist movement must function within the Zionist movement, which was a secular movement, as the Jewish people function within the world as a whole, within the family of nations. Koach shel tesisa temidit, in other words, a force for constant activity and movement in a certain direction, a force for good. Koach shelo yehdal et avodato ve'et segulat hafrayato. Like the yeast, the sourdough that causes bread to rise, in the same way the Jewish people are designed and destined by Hashem to bring about certain revolutions and changes for the better within mankind. And so the Zionist movement requires that same kind of activity and infusion of truth and the light of Hashem. The Zionist movement requires this from the Mizrahi. And he goes on to say, Hadath b'Yisrael, the Jewish religion, the Torah, Or Hashem shebenishmatho, the light of Hashem, which is the soul, the essence of the Jewish people, it is not possible that the national movement of the Jewish people, which aims to bring about a Jewish Renaissance, should be cut off and divorced from this, the true essence and spiritual and ideological essence of its being. These were the views of Rav Kook, as expressed in these three letters and in a number of others, which, for reasons of brevity, we shall not quote here. Thus was the state of affairs and Rav Kook's remarks up to the outbreak of the First World War. The letters we looked at till now were from the year 1913. The First World War began in 1914. As a result of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire, the Turks who had ruled here in the land of Israel for centuries, were removed, as we all know, and were replaced by another colonial power, another empire, the British Empire, who entered the land of Israel in 1917. And in that year, 1917, on the 2nd of November, according to the Gregorian calendar, was announced the famous Balfour Declaration, in which the British government expressed its support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in what they referred to as Palestine. Palestine, of course, was the term invented by another foreign colonial power, the Roman Empire, 1800 years earlier, after the quashing of the Bar Kokhba rebellion against the Roman occupation of the land of Israel. In order to completely stamp out the Jewish people and their sense of nationhood and their attachment to their ancestral land, the Romans renamed the country, which had been known as Judea, they renamed it as Palestina. Palestina, taken from the Hebrew word Pelishtim, or Philistines, who had been the historical enemies of the Jewish people, and by renaming the country Palestina, the Roman intention was, first of all, to insult and denigrate the Jewish people, and to make clear to all, and particularly to the Jewish people themselves, that this was no longer their land, that they had been conquered once and for all, and they would do well to forget all their aspirations and hopes for a Jewish Renaissance in their own land. In the wake of that Balfour Declaration, the Jewish world as a whole, and in fact the Gentile world as well, began to look at the Zionist enterprise in a different light. It seemed now that the new colonial masters, the British, who had now expressed support for this idea, for the Jewish people's desire and aspiration to return and re-establish their national existence in their homeland, it seemed that the Zionist movement was now about to succeed where previously it had not been at all a sure thing that something would come of this Zionist movement. Now it seemed that its future was more or less assured. And Rav Kook, in that year, Tau Resh Ayin Zayin, 1917, wrote an open letter to the Jewish world, to the entire Jewish people, which he entitled Degel Yerushalayim, literally the Jerusalem banner, or the flag of Jerusalem, in which he explained, and this he wrote in the first instance from London, because Rav Kook found himself locked out of the land of Israel during the most of the period of the First World War, and he spent some of that time in London. And so when he was still in London, in the wake of the Balfour Declaration, he wrote an open letter to the Jewish world in which he expressed his view that a new movement needed to be established by all Jews who believed in and lived according to the Torah. And we shall now quote a few lines from this statement of Rav Kook. Rav Kook begins by saying that we are all aware of the Zionist movement, to which he refers here as Degel Zion, the banner on the flag of Zion, which is a general movement for the furtherment of the Jewish people's return to their homeland. But he says it is impossible that the Jewish Torah world, those who are loyal to the Torah, that Rav Kook refers to here as Ha'olam HaKasher HaYisraeli, the true and proper Jewish world, that this part of the Jewish people should be shut out of these activities, of the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and to their true station. And therefore he writes, Lezoth merimim anachnu, for this reason we are raising the banner of Degel Yerushalayim, the banner or the flag of Jerusalem, Sheistadru tachtav kol kesherei Yisrael, so that all religious Torah Jews who believe in the Torah, what we would refer to perhaps today as Orthodox Jews, all such Jews should band together under this flag of Jerusalem. There be a movement by this name, Degel Yerushalayim, which will complement and in some ways even replace the Mizrahi movement. It seems that at this point Rav Kook had reached the conclusion that the Mizrahi movement would never adopt and accept his suggestion and accept his criticism of their behavior and their manner of existing within the Zionist world, and their inability to speak certain basic truths. He apparently reached the conclusion this was never going to happen, and therefore a different organization that would not be a faction of the general Zionist movement, but would be an independent movement expressing the true and authentic voice of the Jewish people based on the Torah, such a movement had to come into being. And again, a few years later, after returning to Jerusalem, in the year Tau Resh Pe'aref, 1921, Rav Kook wrote a second open letter to the Torah world, to the Jewish Orthodox world, in which he reiterated this position. And he states as follows, that in the wake of the declaration, the Balfour Declaration, we must state openly and plainly and make known to all that the Jewish people's national existence and their return to their land must be based on not only a revival of Jewish nationhood and physical existence in their land, but also a revival of their Torah, of their culture, of their practice and study of the Torah. There has to be a tehiyah of the Kodesh, a revival of the spiritual and holy aspects of the Jewish people's existence and life as a nation, just as there is now coming into existence a revival of their national physical existence. Following these statements of Rav Kook, he tried to form alliances and make contact with many other rabbis and Jewish communities around the world. He sent his son Harav Tzvi Yehuda Kook to Europe to discuss these matters with many of the leading rabbis and in the most important communities in Europe, where a majority of the Jewish people resided. Unfortunately, the response was disappointing, to say the least. Essentially, no great rabbinical figure was willing to join such an initiative. Some of them expressed certain positive sentiments towards the idea, but in practice nothing came of it. And this movement, Degel Yerushalayim, remained in fact an idea, a suggestion of Rav Kook, but in fact it never got off the ground. And in fact Rav Kook himself eventually expressed his somewhat reluctant conclusion that for the meantime at least he was to allow this idea to remain an idea, and he did not truly continue to promote the idea in practice. He writes in the third volume of his letters, in the letter number Tau Tau Kof Mem Zayin, that is 947 on page Res Samech Bet 262, Rav Kook writes, Onochi eneni politikani, that is how he expresses himself. I am not a politician. And it is not my way. I am incapable of dealing with ideological conflict and party politics and factions. I am capable, for my part, says Rav Kook, I am only capable of seeing the good in the various phenomena which I see in this world, and I relate to those positive things with love and with respect. And therefore, he says, I do not wish to bring about any kind of competition or acrimony between the movement that I think needs to come into existence, Degel Yerushalayim, and the existing Mizrahi movement. And therefore he writes on the following page, Ka'et hifsakti et ha'pu'ulot l'sha'a. For the meantime, I have put this matter on hold, and I see that the Mizrahi are at present very active, and when any hafetz shetiye benenu hitaharut tagranit, I do not wish there to be any bitter conflict or feeling of infighting between us. So in practice, this movement never got off the ground, which I think, without doubt, is not only a great pity, but perhaps even an error on the part of Rav Kook in not forging ahead with this idea of Degel Yerushalayim. I make this claim because today, 110 years later, nearly 110 years later, we see that the Mizrahi movement, which eventually became known as the political party called the Mafdal, and eventually goes by other names to this day, this movement has allowed itself to be influenced by secular Zionism to the point that the religious Torah aspects of its original philosophy, which from its inception Rav Kook thought was fraught with inner contradictions and confusion, this movement has become so caught up in the politics and the infighting and the realities of Israel, the state of Israel, as it has come to exist down to the present day. It has reached a point where it is essentially bereft of any true allegiance to the Torah, to Judaism, Jewish history and Jewish heritage, and therefore the future and the destiny of the Jewish people. And that which Rav Kook perceived correctly 110 years ago, that such a movement and such a cry must be heard in the public domain, in the public square of the Jewish people, where the ideas are exchanged and where the future of the Jewish people is decided. That movement, which unfortunately never got off the ground so many years ago, most certainly needs to be re-examined today.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar Chaim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar Chaim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar Chaim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.